Hi. I'm Moses. And I'd like to talk to all of you about Bible translation. You all are doing a great job of translating the New Testament. In previous centuries, there weren't a lot of people coming up here from the low-resource language groups on Earth. But these days, there are millions and millions of new people here from the low-resource languages. And the work you all are doing to translate the New Testament into those languages is one of the main reasons they're able to come here now. Many of them have read their New Testaments numerous times. And they're all very appreciative of the work you've done. When these new people get up here, they're all running around looking to meet Paul, and John, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These days, those apostles are all strutting around like they're superstars. But, I have to tell you, I'm a bit disappointed with all of you because most of the new people from the low-resource languages don't know anything about the books that I wrote. Why aren't you translating my books also? When I meet these new people from the low-resource languages, they usually say something like, I think I saw your name a couple times in Matthew's book. Did Matthew mention you? Did you do anything important? Seriously. What's up with that? Matthew wrote 1 book and I wrote 5. I'm not saying it's a contest or anything, but now he's a celebrity, and these people don't even know me. I've heard you all say, the Old Testament is too big, it's too big, we can't translate it. Do you all know how disappointing that is to me and the rest of us who wrote the Old Testament books? I feel bad for King David. When he meets these new people, they've never even heard about him fighting Goliath, and they don't know anything about the book he wrote. But the guys I really feel bad for are Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, and those other prophets. The new people here don't have any idea that those guys wrote anything. People up here don't get depressed, but Haggai is getting close. Why aren't you translating all the books of the Bible? They're all important. In the past, it was okay to say, the Old Testament is too big. But these days, with the new tools that you have, that's not a valid excuse anymore. My friend and colleague, Tod Allman, is a member of all the Word Bible Translators. He's going to tell you about one of these tools. It's called the Bible Translator's Assistant, and it will help you translate the entire Bible. I'm really hoping that in the near future when more new people start arriving here, they'll know all about my books and all of the other books too. So, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Tod. Oh, one more thing. All of the new people who come up here from the high-resource languages deeply regret how much time they spent scrolling through their phones. Just giving you a heads up.
As you heard, my name is Tod, and I'm a member of all the Word Bible Translators. And today I'd like to describe a software tool that we're developing. We call it the Bible Translator's Assistant, or TBTA for short. TBTA is a linguistically motivated, rules-based, natural language generator that uses highly annotated source text. Here at this conference you've been hearing a lot about the new AI tools, and they're fantastic. But TBTA doesn't use AI. TBTA is not a statistical machine translation system, it's not a memory-based system, it's based entirely on linguistics. And it works equally well for low-resource languages, high-resource languages, and no-resource languages. For the AI systems, you've heard you need a lot of training data, typically about 1/3 of the Bible. For TBTA, you don't need any training data. It's based all on linguistics. So if you're starting a brand new translation project, TBTA would be a good choice. And it works equally well for co-ranking languages and clause-chaining languages, highly isolating languages and highly agglutinative languages, etc. These days we have projects in Papua New Guinea, in the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Kenya, India, China, Russia. We're working in a variety of language families, and in every case, TBTA is producing drafts that are easily understandable and nearly grammatically perfect. And I'd like to show you a short video. This is the screen where we do most of our work. And you can see right now we're at Daniel 1:1, And right now a Korean lexicon and grammar are loaded. And as I move the cursor, you can see a pop-up showing all the features associated with that clause. We include an abundance of linguistic information. There's all the features associated with that noun and the features associated with that verb. And over on the right, we have our grammar. And we'll look at just one of the grammar rules for Korean. This rule inserts all of the tense morphemes, the past tense marker, the present tense marker, etc. And the purpose of this software is when we click the Generate button, the software takes our analysis of Daniel 1:1 and applies the Korean lexicon and grammar to it, and there is a draft of Daniel 1:1 in Korean. Now we'll switch to another language. We'll switch to English. So it takes just a minute to load the English lexicon. And we're still at Daniel 1:1, and now you see English words, and the analysis stays the same. The data, all those features are exactly the same. Every target language uses the same source text. We'll look at one of the rules for English. This rule inserts all of the pronouns. So we have personal pronouns, reflexive pronouns, the reciprocal pronoun, possessive pronouns, etc. And now when we click the Generate button, the software will take our analysis of Daniel 1:1 and apply the English lexicon and grammar to it and produce a draft of Daniel 1:1 in English. A man named Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. Another man named Jehoiakim was the king of Judah. When Jehoiakim had been the king of Judah for about 3 years, Nebuchadnezzar and his army went to Jerusalem. Then they attacked Jerusalem and defeated Jehoiakim and his army. We'll switch to one more language, Tagalog. My family and I lived in the Philippines for 7.5 years. So I was able to develop a lexicon grammar for Tagalog. So now you see Tagalog words here. The analysis is still exactly the same. We'll look at one of the rules for Tagalog. This rule inserts all of the case markers. Tagalog uses an ergative absolutive case marking system. So there are all of the case markers for Tagalog. And now when we click the Generate button, the software will take our analysis of Daniel 1:1 and apply the Tagalog lexicon and grammar to it. And there's a draft of Daniel 1:1 in Tagalog. At this screen, we can only work on one verse at a time. But when our lexicon and grammar are well developed, we come to this screen. Here, we can produce drafts of entire books or the entire Bible, if we had source text for the entire Bible. For this video, we'll produce a draft of the book of Genesis. Now this is a time lapse. In real time, this would take about 2 hours, but the software is now taking our analysis of Genesis, one verse at a time, and applying the Tagalog lexicon and grammar to it, and producing what you see here. We could give this draft of Genesis to any Tagalog speaker, and he or she would easily understand it. The draft needs to be cleaned up, it needs to be polished, and sometimes phrases need to be moved or more precise words need to be chosen. It definitely needs to be polished. But we could give this draft to any Tagalog speaker and they would understand it. TBTA is a drafting tool that reduces the time and cost of a translation project by about 35 to 40%. It significantly reduces the drafting stage, and it also somewhat reduces the consultant checking stage because all of our source texts are consultant checked. Here's a high-level model of the system. It begins with our Bible book source text in the upper left corner. We very carefully prepare these source texts. I'll describe it in detail in a few minutes. And then for each target language, we need a lexicon and grammar. Then our software takes our source text and applies the lexicon and grammar to them and produces a draft. We give that draft to the MTTs, they edit it and clean it up, and then that draft goes through the customary team check, community check, and consultant check. For this presentation, I'd like to talk about these 3 components, and we'll begin with the Bible book source text. For our source text, we use a simple subset of English. Years ago, we used to use the Greek and Hebrew text, annotated Greek and Hebrew. But the drafts that were being produced weren't good. Greek and Hebrew, like all languages, they have idioms and euphemisms. Some of their words are semantically very complex. And in the Pauline epistles, some of the sentences were extremely long. And there's ellipsis, and the drafts being produced directly from Greek and Hebrew were not good. So we switched to using English. We use a simple subset of English, simple English words, and simple English structures. Then we highly annotated, as you saw in that video. We had lots of linguistic information to our English text. And our source texts also include an abundance of additional information. We had implicit information. This comes primarily from Ellis Deibler's T for T, Translation for Translators. And for certain select sentences that are hard to understand, we have a literal version and a dynamic version. We also include book introductions, footnotes, study notes. For example, Genesis 3:15b, God is talking to the snake, and he says, he, referring to Eve's son, he will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. Even when this verse is translated perfectly into other languages, people read it, and they think God's talking about a boy and a snake. Now, all of us know this verse is saying much, much more than that. Theologians call this verse the proto-evangelium, the first presentation of the gospel. Here, God is actually predicting Jesus' death and resurrection. But people reading this for the first time, they have no way of knowing that. So we include study footnotes. We want the people all around the world to understand their Bibles the same way that we understand our Bibles. The source texts also include biblical and metric units of measurement. So you can choose whether you want your translation to include the biblical units, like shekels, cubits, omers, etc., or metric units. If you choose biblical units, there's always a footnote explaining the biblical units in terms of metric units. And all of the idioms and euphemisms are eliminated. Here's an example, Mark 10:38. The NIV says, okay, Jesus is talking to James and John. Jesus said, can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? If you're not accustomed to how Jesus talks, this is virtually impossible to understand. So we break this into two questions, and for each question we have a literal version and a dynamic version. Here's the literal version. Jesus said, are you able to drink, implicit information, the bitter drink, from the cup that I'll drink from soon? So we add that implicit information, the bitter drink. We want people to know Jesus isn't talking about wine or water or goat's milk or anything like that. It's something bad. And then we have a dynamic version. Jesus said, are you ready for the same terrible things that will happen to me soon to happen to you? And then for the second question, the literal version. Are you ready to be baptized with the same terrible things that I'll be baptized with? Then the dynamic version. Are you ready to suffer greatly like I'll suffer greatly? So the MTTs, they see all of this information in their language, and then they're able to decide whether they want to use the literal version or the dynamic version. Maybe they want to use the literal version and put the dynamic version in a footnote, or maybe merge the two versions together. They understand it, and they can decide what to do so that typical readers can understand it. For a while, I was working a language in Indonesia called Iboe, that's a pseudonym, and the Iboe translators saw the exact same information in their language. Every language that uses TBTA will see all of that information. Then the MTTs understand it, and they can decide how to deal with it. Building the source text for the book of Mark took about 700 hours. It's an immense amount of work. We rewrite the book using simple English words and simple English sentences, and we highly annotate it. We add an abundance of linguistic information, an abundance of implicit information, footnotes, etc. So it's a lot of work, but after we finish a book, it can be used for any language project. We presently have source text for about a third of the Bible, and we hope to have the entire Bible analyzed by about 2026. Now let's shift to the lexicon and grammar. The lexicon and grammar are language specific. We need to develop a lexicon and grammar for each target language. For the first target language in a language family, it takes about 1 year, and it must be developed by a computational linguist. Analyzing that first language in a language family takes a lot of work. It takes about a year, maybe a year and a half, and I'll show you why in a minute. But we have an adaptation process, or we'll have one soon, hopefully by the end of this year. So it takes approximately 3 months for related languages that are in the same family. And the adaptation process can be done by a bilingual mother tongue speaker without any knowledge of linguistics or computer skills. So that first language is a lot of work, but for related languages, it goes much more quickly. The transfer grammar consists of rules that restructure the source text, and they build a new deep structure representation appropriate for each target language. Our source texts are heavily influenced by English. They use concepts that have been lexicalized by English and English sentence structures. Other languages have different deep structure representations. So these rules take our source text and restructure them however necessary. I'll show you an example in a minute. Then the synthesizing grammar synthesizes the final surface forms. The synthesizing grammar has the rules that linguists always talk about. The synthesizing grammar has the phrase structure rules, the spell-out rules, agreement rules, morphophonemic rules, clitic rules, etc. Here's an example of a synthesizing grammar rule from Megabot. I've been working with Steve McAvoy. Steve McAvoy and his family translated the New Testament into Megabot. That's a Papuan language spoken in Papua New Guinea. And Steve wrote a very thorough description of Megabot for his thesis. And his thesis includes numerous tables of suffixes and pronouns and so on. And so when we started this project, Steve sent me his thesis, and I copied and pasted all of his tables into a Word document, and then TBTA scanned through that Word document and built these rules for us. So this particular rule has all of the object agreement suffixes. And down in the comment you see page 35. That means page 35 of Steve's thesis. Here's an example of one of the transfer grammar rules, and this is why we need computational linguists. For example, in 2 Samuel 17:14, Hushai's advice is better than Ahithophel's advice. So here's a comparative adjective. English uses comparative adjectives, so our source texts use comparative adjectives. Megabot does not use comparative adjectives. Their equivalent is, the goodness of Hushai's advice surpasses Ahithophel's advice. So Megabot has a completely different sentence structure. And here's the rule that does that. You can see an input structure and an output structure. In the input structure, it's looking for one noun phrase, the agent, and then the verb to be, and then good, and then there's another noun phrase. So this is saying one thing is better than another thing. And you can see that C down below good. That stands for comparative. C is comparative degree. So whenever a construction like this occurs in our source text, this rule will convert this structure to what's specified in the output. So you can see, in the output, the noun maditne is inserted. That's their noun for goodness. And that becomes the new subject of the sentence. And then the original agent modifies maditne, it becomes a possessor of maditne. And then the verb is iwali. That's their verb for meaning surpass or exceed. And then good is deleted, and the standard of comparison becomes the object of the verb. So this rule will convert the English structure in our source text to the Megabot structure. And then TBTA can produce the goodness of Hushai's advice surpasses Ahithophel's advice. Now let's switch to the software. The software will translate any text that has been manually pre-analyzed. This is why it's a natural language generator and not a machine translation system. We have to very thoroughly, manually analyze all of our source texts. And it will export drafts directly to paratext. It'll export the grammar rules to a grammar sketch. If you want to publish a grammar sketch of your language, after you've built the grammar in TBTA, you can click an export button and it will export your grammar. It'll export the lexicon to a dictionary, and the software can be downloaded for free from alltheword.org. Here's how the system works. One of my colleagues, Craig Palmer, meets online with Anthony Muthomi. Anthony is a mother tongue speaker of Gichuka, and they meet online typically about 3 times a week for about an hour each time, And Craig asks Anthony many questions about Gichuka. And Anthony tells him the answers, and Craig enters all that data into the software. And then Craig will send Anthony a draft of a passage, and Anthony will mark it up and then send it back, and Anthony will explain all the changes to Craig, and Craig will put as many of those changes as possible into the software, and they go back and forth, and eventually TBTA is producing very good drafts. They've worked through Ruth, and they're very close to finishing the book of Genesis. And earlier this year, Craig and another one of my colleagues, David Duncan, they went to Kenya and visited the Gichuka project and demonstrated TBTA, and one of the leaders of that project made a testimonial video for us. And here's an excerpt. I thought TBTA would produce drafts that need a lot of cleaning up. Today they came and showed us what they have been doing with the Chuka project here in Kenya. And it shocked me, because what they are calling a first draft is quite advanced. Actually, it is far beyond a first draft. It is very advanced, very clean, with very few discrepancies. TBTA, without any doubt, is producing a very nice translation. I would be afraid to call it a draft. So, clearly, Craig and Anthony are doing very good work. But I want to emphasize, TBTA is producing a draft. I don't want to contradict this man. We greatly appreciate his endorsement. But TBTA produces drafts, and those drafts need to be edited by the MTTs. Those drafts need to go through the customary team check, community check, and consultant check. When is it appropriate to use TBTA? Whenever an AI system isn't an option. The new AI systems, they're fantastic. And if they're an option for your language, then you should use it. They're so easy to use. They're so fast. If that's an option, then you should use it. But if an AI system isn't an option, because either you don't have sufficient training data, for example, if you haven't yet translated a third of your Bible, or if there isn't a good source translation in a related language, if for some reason an AI solution isn't an option, then TBTA is a very good option. You should use TBTA if you want a translation roughly equivalent to the NIV, not highly dynamic like the New Living Translation, not highly literal like the King James. Our software has options, so you can make your draft slightly more dynamic or slightly more literal, but they're going to come out sounding somewhat similar to the NIV. So that concludes my presentation. You can visit our website at alltheword.org. We have numerous videos describing how to use the software. You can download the software for free, as I said earlier. We have articles describing each of the projects we're currently working on. If you want to contact me after this conference, my email address is Tod_Allman@alltheword.org.